Today we're going to be installing this glass mosaic tile into this wall accent area. Instead of using mastic like I normally would on drywall, I'm going to use this Bondera mat. This is like a double-sided sticky mat that you apply to your drywall. You peel it back and then you're going to apply your tile right over it. So any little indentations that I have in the drywall, I'm just going to go ahead and take this mallet and just hammer them flush. I always like to take a level or a straight edge and check my wall, making sure there's no bulges or big gaps that I need to fill, because the Bondera mat doesn't allow you any flexibility in variations within the wall surface. Next, I'm just going to clean my wall area. I'm just using simple green, something just to make sure there's not a bunch of junk all over your wall surface. Just going to put a little bit of tape on the top of my Bondera mat. I'm going to go ahead and just dry fit it. So I'm going to fit it on the top here, flush. I'm going to work it down, and then I'm just going to cut it. Okay, the mat's cut to size. Now all I do is just peel back the adhesive. I'm not going to peel back the whole thing. I'm just going to start my corner so I can get my corner lined up. Now I'm going to peel as I go. So I got my corner exposed. Just going to line it up. Basically have one shot. So make sure it's correct before you adhere it down. Now I'm just going to start peeling the backer back and working the mat onto the drywall surface. The key here is you don't want to get any bubbles or folds in the mat. So just go slow and smooth as you peel it back. So all I do is just keep pulling the backing paper away and smoothing as I go. Make sure you don't get any wrinkles in it or creases. That's the only thing you have to be concerned about. So this next piece won't be the full width. I'm going to check my dimensions, and it varies from about 14 5/8 to 14 1/2. So I'm going to cut it to width before I put it up. The mat cuts really easily just with plain scissors. It's got the layout marks on it, so very easy to follow to get a straight cut. So I've cut the width just a little oversized because of the irregularities in this wall. I'm going to peel the corner of my backing and get it in place. Make sure it doesn't overlap, but instead just fits flush. Only thing you got to be careful about is once this is down, it's not coming back up. So make sure it's where you want it before you press it in place. You can just trim the bottom flush with a utility blade. Just peel it up. You can see how sticky this stuff is. Now I just make sure the Bondera is all firmly attached to my wall. I've got a laminate roller. You don't really need one, but it makes the job a little bit easier. Otherwise, just make sure it's properly pressed into the wall. A critical step in a good tile installation is layout. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my width and my length and see how it translates in regards to what my tile is going to look like. So I got 30 1/2 by 65 inches. What I don't want happening is I don't want little slivers here and full pieces up there. I want a balanced layout in such a small area. So I want my tile to be equal on the top and bottom, as well as to the left to the right. So on a small area like this, the easiest thing to do is lay the tile out on the floor and see where the cuts are going to fall. So I've got my tile laid out the way it's going to look on the wall, except for this little piece right here. And the issue that I have is 65 inches, which is my layout, falls just short of a full piece of tile. So I'm going to cut probably 1/4 of the tile at the bottom I can't really split the difference because the tiles are too small and it's just going to be a sliver at the top and the bottom. And the same goes for the width. 30.5 just falls shy of a full tile, so I'll just trim one side of it. That should give me probably the most balanced layout. But this step is critical before you start throwing tiles up. You want to make sure that your tile layout is as eye-pleasing as possible. If you're going to mount anything, the best thing to do is put your fasteners in now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hang this in the center of the tiled surface. I'm going to tile all around it, but I'm going to put my wall anchors in place before I do the tile. It's just going to be a little bit easier. So before we start tiling, I'm going to go ahead and release the top film coat. All you do is take one of these little tabs Bondera gives you, and this allows you to pull up on this film coat and it just pulls right up. Now you only want to remove as much protective film as you can tile in a day. So don't get carried away removing too much of this stuff. I'm ready to lay down the first piece of tile. Normally I don't do this, but since my drywall shelf here is pretty much level, I'm going to use that as my leveling standard. And from there I'm going to move up. Most of the time your walls can't be relied upon, so don't use them. In this situation, it just happens to be pretty good. Your first piece is critical because all the other pieces are going to come off of that. The nice thing with the Bondera mat is if I lightly adhere it, I still can have some wiggle room to move this tile around. So I'm just going to go ahead and position my first couple pieces just very lightly and see how everything looks, see if everything's lined up properly. You can use anything you want for spacers. I'm using these pieces of 16 gauge because it just happens to work out perfectly. You can go ahead and buy regular spacers if you like. Doesn't really matter, just as long as you get the spacing between these sheets correct. Just works out that I'm just using what I had laying around. So you have a little bit of wiggle room with the Bondera mat, which is kind of nice. It allows you to position it much easier. Okay, that looks good. So I just remove my spacer and set it in place. This is the area that I'm going to need to cut in. So I'm just going to take my measurement. And I seriously recommend using a wet saw. It's going to make your life so much easier. If you don't have a wet saw, go ahead and take it to a tile shop that does. This piece has been cut on the tile saw. It gives you a nice clean edge. I'm just going to line this up. Hopefully I don't get in the camera's way. So once I'm certain that my first course is set properly, I could go ahead and just using a grout float, push everything into the Bondera mat. I just apply pressure and this bonds the tile to the mat. Now we're ready for our second row. It's just a matter of lining up the tile and setting it in place. Using a tile saw is really pretty simple. All you do is just adjust your fence for the size cut you need. Set your tile in place. Put on some safety glasses, turn the machine on, start cutting. Once you get things moving, it's just a matter of laying sheet after sheet. Like I was saying earlier, walls are very rarely straight. This cut, I had to cut 4 3/4 at the bottom, and it tapers into 4 5/8 at the top. That's pretty common, you see stuff like that. So always measure top and bottom whenever you're cutting up against a wall. our last row of tile, just needed about 1/8 of an inch trimmed off the top. Okay, mixing up grout is pretty straightforward. I'm going to go ahead and use a sanded grout. So we're going to go ahead and just pour the sanded grout into a bucket. And you're going to add water mixed to about a peanut butter-like consistency. Grout mixes up really easy. I'm not going to use an electric paddle or anything like that. Just a scrap piece of wood will get it mixed up nicely. When you're mixing grout, just make sure you get rid of all the lumps and clumps in it. Right about here is where you want your grout. Okay, so when I mixed up my grout at first, the instructions say let it sit for about 5 minutes and mix it again. That's exactly what I did. Here's the consistency you like. Peanut butter. Doesn't fall off of your trowel or your stick, your mixing stick. Got my grout float. Get a decent grout float. They don't cost all that much. And the most important thing is get a decent grouting sponge. This is about a $2 sponge, but it's going to make the world of difference when it comes to cleaning the grout off of your tile. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to squeeze out my grouting sponge really good. I'm just going to wipe down all my tiles. Now I'm going to scoop up a little bit of grout. I'm going to start from the bottom and just start working it into the joint. That's all you have to do. Just go in diagonally, work your grout into the joint. Going at a 45-degree angle helps fill the joints a little bit easier. So what I'll typically do is I'll work about 15 minutes worth of grout, meaning I'm going to go ahead and apply about 15 minutes worth of grout before I start cleaning off the residue. Another thing that you can do is I've left about a 1/16 of an inch gap all the way around. You can go ahead and fill that with grout. Sometimes if you have a lot of excessive movement, you might have a crack along this area where the wall meets the tile in the grout. If you want to avoid that, if it's going to be a problem, if you want to avoid it, just go ahead and tape that joint up or get the grout out of there while it's wet and put caulking in there instead. So that'll prevent it from cracking. Caulking will be more flexible. Last thing I do before I start wiping up my grout is I'll go through and I'll make sure that everything is filled with grout and I've wiped up as much as I can using the grout float. The areas that I always watch for is around the edges. Most of the field gets covered pretty quick, but the edges and the corners tend to sometimes be left out. So just work that area nicely with your float. Scrape off any excess grout that you still have on the tile. And we'll be ready for step 2. You can see the grout starting to set up because you've got this haze forming on it. And once the haze starts to form, this is the perfect time to hit it with the sponge. I've got my grout sponge, and what I've done is I've wrung it out quite a bit. It's not really all that wet. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start going over the tile in a circular motion. What this will do is this will tool the joint just a little bit. It'll smooth out the joint. I'll make sure I get off all of my grout from my wall surfaces as well. Just kind of going a round motion all over the tiles. One thing you want to do is you want to rinse out your sponge quite often. And when you rinse it, make sure you wring it out really well. You don't want to introduce a bunch of water back into the grout. So the drier the sponge, the better. As soon as the tile's hazed up a bit, you take your relatively dry sponge and you start wiping it at a 45-degree angle. I'll rinse the sponge right about every 2 passes. Just keep working down at a 45-degree angle. I'll come up with one side and come back up with the other side of the sponge and keep going until all of the tile is wiped up. The great thing about using that Bondera mat because I don't have to wait for the tile to dry before I can grout. See, right about here, it's looking pretty good. A couple more wipes like that, and we'll be pretty much done, except for the final little buffing with a towel. So at this point, I'm just about done wiping my tiles. I'm going to go ahead and take a look to make sure I don't have any areas that need a little bit of touch up. I see one little void right here in the grout. This is the time to kind of pay attention to the details. Make sure you've sufficiently filled all of your grouting areas. Like here's a little spot right there, and there's a little indentation. I'm just going to go ahead and go back and fill those little areas with grout, and we'll be done. After my second pass with the sponge, I waited about 30 minutes for the grout to fully set up and haze again. Now I'm just going to take a towel, basically just buff off the dried haze. And this is the final step. After you're done with this, the installation is done. This ended up costing $150. It was $75 for the tile, about $5 a square foot at Lowe's, $60 for the Bondera mat, $14 for grout. Take about 4 hours of your time to do. That's provided if you're not filming. Then you can have a nice glass mosaic inset anywhere you want.